Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. Well, change is coming, and that change is scary because what happens when things change is unknown. But it's inevitable. The U.S. is losing its dominance on the world stage, and the dollar will soon no longer be the world's reserve currency. And that's scary for many of us because many of us are Americans and we rely on dollars to survive. And we've seen what happens to other countries when their currency is devalued and massive inflation hits, oftentimes caused by U.S. sanctions, and we don't want that happening to us. But during last week's meeting between Putin and Xi said this to Putin: "Change is coming that hasn't happened in 100 years, and we are driving this change together," he said. Now, over the weekend, an interesting thing happened. Both CNN and Fox News ran stories about the end of U.S. dollar hegemony. Here's CNN's Fareed Zakaria talking about the desire for BRICS countries to move to the yuan as the global currency.
Putin said, "We are in favor of using the Chinese yuan for settlements between Russia and the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America." So, the world's second largest economy and its largest energy exporter are together actively trying to dent the dollar's dominance as the anchor of the international financial system. Will they succeed?
Now here's Fox and Friends Weekend talking about the shift away from the U.S. dollar by BRICS nations.
Putin announced this week that Russia will begin using the Chinese yuan for international payments instead of the dollar. Saudi Arabia is also in talks with Beijing to do the same thing. And they can even be joining the BRIC countries, which is an acronym for these countries here: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries all have emerging economies. So what happens if our economy and the U.S. dollar are no longer the world's dominant currency?
And I'm actually going to break that down exactly what will happen, what this means for both you and me. But right now, what we know is that if both left and right mainstream media are talking about it, you know that this is something that's serious. It's really about to happen. So first of all, what is BRICS and how can it topple U.S. dollar dominance? BRICS is an acronym. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's kind of like the G7. It's an alliance for peace, security, development, and cooperation. Essentially, these are really large, powerful nations that honestly just feel like they've been ostracized by the West and are looking to develop into nations that they believe they can become. And they decided that rather than waiting for an invite to the table, it's best to just start their own. And that's what they did. So now more nations want a seat at their table, and some of them are extremely consequential. Right now, there are about 20 known countries wishing to become part of the BRICS alliance. Among them are Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and a number of African countries. But most significant on this list would be Mexico and Saudi Arabia. Now let's talk about Mexico potentially joining BRICS. Reports have been coming out that Mexico was seeking to join the countries in this alliance, that they were looking for to really sort of expand their economic footprint around the world. But let's just be real here. Mexico is actually not likely to pursue joining BRICS. They're right on our border, and we've seen what has happened around the world when other leaders tried to challenge U.S. global hegemony. They end up like Gaddafi, and Mexico, I think, wouldn't want to end up like that, and it would be much easier to get down there. And you've got people right now in Congress posturing about sending troops into Mexico to fight the cartels, which very well just could be a cover for why we would really need to go into Mexico, and that's to prevent them from joining BRICS. It wouldn't be about the cartels. We've been dealing with the cartels for a long time. We've been dealing with drugs coming into America for a really long time. The real reason why the United States might want to strong arm or posture against Mexico is to scare it away from joining the BRICS nations. That would be the real reason there. And because of it, because we're right on their border, Mexico is actually not likely to pursue a BRICS membership, even if they would like to. But Saudi Arabia would actually be the real consequential kicker. If Saudi Arabia were to join BRICS, this would change everything. And not just for the U.S., not just for U.S. hegemony around the world, not just for the power of the dollar and the sanctions that the U.S. could put on other countries. This would affect you and me. So let's talk about why Saudi Arabia even uses the dollar to begin with. This was a deal that was done back in 1951. The U.S. did a security deal with Saudi Arabia where we would protect them in their rough neighborhood in the Middle East in exchange for oil being sold exclusively in dollars. This was a deal that worked out well for both nations. Saudi Arabia got their security. The United States ensured that the value of the dollar remained high by ensuring that all oil was done in dollars, all the oil deals done in dollars. Because of this, and this is where it gets to massive inflation, because of this deal, every single nation on earth wanting oil needed to get their hands on dollars. So the US dollar became in high demand. The central bank, of course, prints dollars, sends dollars all around, sends these dollars to other central banks in these trades, in these exchange. So dollars are everywhere. There's now, because of this deal that was done 70 years ago, dollars have flooded the world. Dollars are everywhere. Every country in the world needs dollars. And we've seen what happens to countries who can't get dollars. Maybe the United States has them on their shit list and ultimately they're not able to get the dollars they need. We've seen this happen to Iran, to Venezuela, to many other nations around the globe. Dollars are in demand. They've been weaponized. But because dollars are so in demand and because they're everywhere, when the dollars are no longer in demand because there's another currency that could be used to buy oil, what happens with those dollars? They need to go somewhere. So they start flooding back into the United States. And when they flood back into the United States, we are looking at record levels of inflation like you and I could not even imagine. You think the inflation we're dealing with right now is bad? Just wait for when all of those dollars start getting dumped onto U.S. soil. And that might actually already have something to do with our current inflation crisis. And maybe the powers that be just don't want to admit it. But ultimately, if Saudi Arabia decides that they no longer need U.S. security, which let's face it, it's not clear they do. I mean, at this point, who's really threatening Saudi Arabia in the Middle East anymore? They just did a peace deal with Iran, essentially, with China brokering that deal. Iraq is not really a threat to Saudi Arabia. They're not really dealing with the same level of threats in the Middle East that they used to. The Middle East is becoming more and more stabilized. And as these nations get along, it will only become even more stable. So Saudi Arabia is starting to rethink their deal, thinking, we don't really need the United States as much anymore. And so why are we just ensuring that every single barrel of oil gets sold in dollars and then the U.S. goes around and bullies countries all around the world? Nobody wants to be the next Russia. They see what's happening to Russia. They don't want that happening to them. They don't like the U.S. exerting their power, abusing power in this way, and they're looking for an alternative. They're not looking necessarily to replace the dollar. That wouldn't be wise either. Saudi Arabia, because they've been selling oil exclusively for dollars, guess what? They got a lot of dollars. So it's not really in Saudi Arabia's best interest to dump the dollar entirely either. But it's also not necessarily in their best interest to stay on the dollar when we've seen increased rhetoric against Saudi Arabia for Jamal Khashoggi, for human rights abuses, for the war in Yemen. And so Saudi Arabia is starting to rethink their deal. They're not so certain they have a true partnership with the United States, and they're looking at diversifying their accounts, like many of us want to do. We don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. Saudi Arabia is starting to think the same thing. But when those dollars start getting dumped back onto the U.S. shore, because that's where you can spend them, and all these countries have too many dollars, we are going to see a massive, massive amount of inflation here in the United States. So much so that I guarantee you politicians in Washington will do anything they can to prevent that sort of catastrophic, and believe me, it would be catastrophic inflation. They would be willing to go to war over it. And that is why we're seeing such an increase in all of the war posturing against Russia, against China. We are trying to stop that massive, massive record inflation that could debilitate all of our lives here in the United States. And it's something really, truly to think about. Don't think war is the answer, but certainly it is something that would be extremely scary and very, very devastating for all of us here in the United States. And there's got to be a way, and we need to be having these conversations. And it's good that mainstream media now, CNN, Fox, are starting to bring this up, because this is a national conversation we need to be having. What are we going to do when those dollars start getting dumped here onto the U.S. shore? Of course, the Federal Reserve already has an answer for that, right? They want to go to central bank digital currency. They're trying to move us towards these other things, trying to salvage the whole situation. But ultimately, what do we end up with? A surveillance state, a big brother state. We end up in a place that is unrecognizable from where we are right now. And that is potentially where we're headed. So it's time to start having these conversations. What are we going to do? What are we going to do other than wage World War III? That is the big question. All right, we do have a great show for you. Putin is sending nukes to Belarus while the UK sends ammo containing depleted uranium to Ukraine. Things are definitely escalating. Also, a retired Marine colonel makes the case for why the U.S. needs to protect Taiwan. Of course, him and I have some disagreements on this, but we will get into that later on in the show. That plus a lot more is coming up next. Buy gold and get a free safe to store it in. That's right, on qualifying purchases from Birch Gold Group now through March 31st, which is coming right up. They'll ship a free safe directly to your door. All you have to do is visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit on gold and to claim eligibility for your free safe. The Fed keeps raising the rates, as you know, because it's the only tool they have to try to keep inflation under control, but it's not working. And you just can't spend your way out of inflation. You've seen the impact on the stock market. You've seen the impact on your savings. Hedge inflation by owning gold, whether it be physical gold and silver that you're going to store in your safe or through an IRA in precious metals where you can hold real gold and silver in a tax-sheltered retirement account. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of satisfied customers, so they can really help you out. Just visit birchgold.com/Kim. You're going to get a free info kit on gold. A specialist will contact you, and you'll be able to start diversifying your accounts. Plus, you're going to be able to claim eligibility for your free home safe by March 31st on those qualifying purchases. So again, visit birchgold.com/Kim.